Okay, this meeting is being recorded. So again, if anyone comments, please don't hesitate, but I'm going to ask you to please put them in the chat. Okay, so before I even get going this evening, as I'm looking over at my wife, um, this the the issue or part of the issue that we're going to discuss is sort of upsetting for those of us who are lefties, which both my wife and I are. Um, and what happens is there's an assumption in this entire Devar Torah that's going to be developed over the next whatever it is, 45, 50 minutes. The whole idea is that somehow left or the left side is inferior to the right side, which is which we know is true throughout history. The Latin word for left is sinister, and we know that throughout the ages, many people forced lefties to use their right hand. That in military. In armies, they wanted everybody to be right-handed because they wanted everyone to do things the exact same way so the army could move together. So throughout history, being left-handed was often a bit of a handicap, and that idea of left side being inferior to right side is inherent in a lot of the discussions we're going to have this evening. But it's just a reality. I think the modern world has thank God gotten better at at being more tolerant of difference than historically most societies were. But there is a premise behind much of tonight's Devar Torah that the left side is inferior to the right side. Okay, so we begin with the famous pasuk where Yaakov Avinu has his two grandsons in front of him, the two children of Yosef. He has Efraim and Menashe, and then it says Vayishlach Yisrael. The translation from JPS, the Jewish Publication Society, in front of us says but. I don't know why it says but. I would have said and, but I just use the Jewish Publication Society translations without changing them. But Yisrael, Yishlach, sent forth his right hand and laid it on Ephraim's head, though he was the younger. So the assumption is that the right hand, the stronger hand, the superior hand, should go on the head of the Bechor, the Bechor of the firstborn. Instead, he put it on Ephraim, the younger. And his left hand, again, to my embarrassment, the inferior hand, on Menashe, on the older son's head, crossing his hands. So in other words, he has in front of him, Menashe is on his right side, and Ephraim is on his left side, but he sends his right hand this way and his left hand that way onto the heads of his two grandsons. And so now everybody's going to talk about that idea. And in a couple of verses, Yosef is going to complain about this. No, Abba, you can't do that. I mean, we all know how our children complain about the things we do. Oh no, Abba, you can't do that. And then his father says, Yaakov Avinu says, no, this is not a mistake. I'm not senile. I haven't lost it. This is the way it's supposed to be because I have seen into the future, and I can tell you that Ephraim is going to be greater than Menashe. And that's true. It's actually true. The tribe of Ephraim, number one, has Yoshua, is from Ephraim, and he leads the nation. And that later, in about, from this story, in about 500 years, the kingdom, the Jewish nation, as kingdoms in a split, the southern kingdom will be controlled by Yehuda, and the northern kingdom will be controlled by Ephraim. And Ephraim, the northern kingdom of Israel, is going to be stronger and much bigger than the kingdom of Yehuda. So, which is the southern one, controlled by the descendants of King David, descendants of Yehuda, while the northern tribe are the descendants of Yeravam ben Nevat, who's from the tribe of Ephraim. So it's true what Yaakov Avinu is predicting. So what's going on here? So let's see how different commentaries deal with the situation, because we're going to say something very, very nice in about 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes. We're going to say something very nice about these two brothers. That's very critical. But first, let's talk about the scenario of the switching the hands and why one goes first and one goes second. So Rashi says that the Hebrew is sikal. Now, we know the word sikal. It can give us words about switching, but usually we think of the word sikal comes into modern Hebrew as haskala, intelligence. Seichel, which in Yiddish we mean common sense, but in Hebrew originally just meant overall intelligence. So he moved his hands. When he switches them, he does it on purpose, cunningly, placing his hands designedly is the translation from Sefaria. Understand this as Onkelos renders it, that lahaskel means achakminun, from the word chachma, that he's doing this very intelligently. He's planned it out carefully. He put wisdom into them, his hands, meaning designedly, he moved his hands for this purpose, cunningly, intelligently, with full knowledge. For he knew that Menashe was the firstborn, and yet he did not place his right hand upon him. The Sforno is sort of agreeing. He says, Sikelet Yadeh, he again moved his hands intelligently. He was quite clear, but he was relying on a sense of touch without being able to see exactly where his hands came to rest. He's saying that the idea of moving his hands carefully was because he was starting to lose his sight like his father did. And a number of commentaries talk about the fact that at the end, Yaakov was losing his eyesight, even though the verses don't say it specifically. But there is an assumption in many commentaries that he's sticking out his hands and feeling, and he could tell which son was which by the way they felt, because he was, like his father, at the end of his days, going blind. Okay. The Chizkuni. He placed his right hand on the head of Ephraim. He did so with the intent of including them in the 12 tribes. Aha. The big deal here, according to the Chizkuni, and we're going to see on the back page, we're going to see someone else, the Netivot Shalom, is going to talk about this idea as well. Maybe we'll do that piece right after this piece. We'll skip over. That basically we're saying, oh, this is so terrible. He's putting Ephraim before Menashe when Menashe is older. But what else is he doing here? The Chizkuni is pointing out he's giving Yosef 2 tribes. What is the reward? What is the prize for being the Bechor, for being the oldest son? You inherit Pi Shnayim, a double portion. So every other son of Yaakov gets 1 tribe, but Yosef gets 2 tribes. So not only in this idea of crossing his hands is he putting Ephraim in front of Menashe, he's also putting Yosef in front of Reuven. So this whole problem of who comes first and who do you give the Bechor, the rights of the firstborn to, is an ever existing problem in the Jewish nation. You know, Yitzchak is younger than Yishmael. Yaakov is younger than Esav. and Yosef is younger than Reuven. And of course, it just continues into the next generation that Ephraim is younger than Menashe. We'll talk more about how it is that Yosef gets two tribes in just a couple of minutes. But let's finish the Chizkuni. We find a similar expression when Moses, placed his hands on Yoshua, appointing him as his successor. In other words, the idea of putting hands on someone's head represents a transfer of power. It was a way of demonstrating that I am handing over some of my samchut, some of my authority to this other person. And we see that throughout Jewish history. And actually, that's why the process of someone becoming a rabbi is called smicha. And smicha really means to lean on the other person. And the way it used to be done, there are actually a couple of places that when they give smicha actually do have the Rosh Hashiva put his hands on the head of the person receiving, but it's not that common anymore. But when you go back to the days of the Sanhedrin, that's how they gave smicha. The person who was giving this ordination, the right to call themselves rabbi, would literally put his hands on the head of the other individual, which we see, by Moshe does it to Yoshua. We see Yaakov is doing it to his grandchildren. And of course, Eliyahu does it to Elisha. So there is biblical precedent for this idea of hands on the head or shoulders of the recipient of this samchut, of this power. Okay. One could have thought that instead of crossing his hands, Yaakov should have asked that the sons of Joseph switch their positions in front of their grandfather. Why couldn't he just say, I want you, Ephraim, to stand on my right side, and I want you, Menashe, to be on my left side? He could have asked them to move. Why do you have to, do this, weird crossing hands sort of secret handshake type thing? What's going on here? But that is precisely what Yaakov didn't want them to do. He didn't. Number one, he doesn't want to embarrass Menashe. He loves his grandchildren. He doesn't want to embarrass Menashe by saying, oh, no, move over there. No, he lets him stay where he is, number one. Seeing that after all, he was Joseph's firstborn, and he deserved to be treated with respect. The only reason he had not placed his right hand on the head of Menashe was that he had seen through his Holy Spirit that his younger brother would historically be of greater importance and power than the firstborn. With that in mind, we're going to talk more about why he didn't ask them to switch places in the Netziv. But before we do the Netziv, I'm going to ask you to go on the back page for just 1 minute. The Netivot Shalom, the second comment on page 2. The Netivot Shalom, who is the Compliment-Rabbi, who was a great rabbi here in Yerushalayim until he passed away 23 years ago. And he is explaining why it's so important mystically for Yosef to have two tribes. Okay. Yosef is the only son to get two tribes. Why? Because he is the character trait of Yesod. Think about Sukkot for a minute. On Sukkot, we invite into the sukkah every night Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Yosef, Moshe, Aharon, and David. Each one of those 7 ushpizin, including Yosef, each one of those ushpizin represents another character trait. And the character trait of Yosef HaTzadik is called Yesod, because there's a pasuk that says tzaddik. Remember, Yosef is the one who is always called the tzaddik. Why is Yosef called tzaddik? Because he refrains from giving in to his Yetzer Hara, the famous story with Potiphar, but other proofs to that effect. He controls his natural human inclinations. So he's called the tzaddik. And there's a pasuk in Mishle that says, tzaddik yesod olam. The tzaddik is the foundation of the world. So his character trait, his sphira in mystical language, is called yesod. And yesod, unlike other character traits, Tiferet also has two aspects, but generally most of the character traits have one aspect, but Yesod has two parts, two different sides to the coin, because the tzaddik, who is the Yesod, the foundation, the firm underpinnings of society, is number one, he's a tzaddik because he avoids evil and then does good. He is always making sure that he avoids sin, and he's always doing mitzvot. That's the tzaddik. And to avoid evil, you need yirah, fear. To do good, you need ahava, love. So the nature, mystically, of the personality of the tzaddik, who is Yosef, is two parts. So since he represents the two parts, he gets two tribes. But it goes on. Menashe is called the avoidance of sin and evil. Why? Because when he's born, his father says, I avoided difficulties. So Menashe, nishani me'ra'ah, I avoided evil. So he is the first part, avoiding the bad part. Ephraim is acquiring good stuff because Ephraim is connected to the world, fruitful, good stuff. So Menashe represents avoiding bad, and Ephraim represents doing good. Since Yirah is always considered the left side or the left hand of God, Yaakov puts his left hand on Menashe. Ahava is the right side, and therefore his right hand goes on the head of Ephraim. That's why he switches the hands. They're standing, oldest on the right, youngest on the left, but he switches his hands because their character traits are Ephraim is the right hand of love, and Menashe is the left hand of fear, which is not just fear, but concern to make sure you never do anything wrong. So that's why they have to stand where they stand in age order, but the hands go on their heads for blessing based upon their character traits. Okay, so the Netivot Shalom isn't putting it into a historical framework. Like we said a couple of minutes ago in the Chizkuni, that Ephraim would be much more powerful than Menashe. He's instead saying it has to do with mystical character traits. Okay, back to page 1. The Nitziv. Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the last Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin, the father of Meir Bar Ilan. Okay, so he explains, he guided his hands. For Menashe was the firstborn. He guided his hands away from where they would have normally gone. It's extra, for we know that Menashe was his firstborn. Why did the pasuk at the end, he says he guided his hands because Menashe was his first. We already knew Menashe was his firstborn. The Torah doesn't waste words like that. Yaakov shouldn't have crossed his hands. I mean, yes, he should have, but we're saying it right now. Rather, switch the positions of the boys. Rather going like this with his hands. Why doesn't he just put, Menashe on the other side and Ephraim on the other side? But since Menashe was the firstborn, he intended that Menashe should stand by Yaakov's right leg, the right side, and Ephraim by his left leg, the left side. Only his hands did he guide that they should be crossed. The reason is that even though Yaakov put Ephraim before Menashe, and therefore in the wilderness he was the head of the flag group, still in the counting of Parsha Pinchas, it was the opposite. we have two different countings of the tribes in the book of Bamidbar. In one of them, Ephraim comes first. In the other one, Menashe comes first. In other words, even though Ephraim would eventually become the dominant tribe, nevertheless, there are many times when Menashe is given the honor of coming first, including cases right there in the book of Bamidbar. Not only that, but even in the counting of Pashas Bamidbar, it is written by all the other flags and those that camped upon him. As opposed to Menashe, it is written, and upon him, the tribe of Menashe. So we saw some honor given to the tribe of Menashe, that he was the leader of one of the four groupings of how the tribes marched. This teaches that Ephraim only came before Menashe in matters of spirituality. In matters of this world, Menashe, at least in the Sefer of Bamidbar, Menashe still comes before Ephraim. So according to the Netziv, the reason that Menashe is standing on the right, even though he gets the left hand, is because there were areas in which he did precede his younger brother. And the same thing was true with Ephraim. Ephraim's on the left side because sometimes he is in second place. But ultimately, he will come out on top in first place. Okay. But in the counting the plains of Moab, as they're getting ready to enter the land of Israel, which was in a natural way, Menashe again comes first. This occurred because with natural occurrences, the advantage of the firstborn is very impactful. Now this is an important idea. In natural, physical things, being the firstborn quite often gives you tremendous advantages. You had more time with your parents. You were around longer. Quite often, there are just advantages for being the firstborn. However, when it comes to spiritual things, that is based upon not experience necessarily or how much attention you got. It's based on your own spiritual inner predilections. That can go often to the younger one because he may have more going on inside of him. So the Netziv is saying that it wasn't across the board that Ephraim always precedes Menashe. And that's why Yaakov had Menashe continue to stand on the right side. Ephraim continues to stand on the left side, but he switched his hands because sometimes one's on top and sometimes the other is on top. And the Netziv, I think, is the only one that says that this combination continued for quite a while, hundreds of years into the future. Okay, so now let's flip over to the back side again. Okay, the Kli Yakar. Okay, the Kli Yakar, who is writing in the beginning of the 1600s, beginning of the 17th century, he asks a different question. We can ask, why was Yosef silent? In other words, if you read the verses in our chapter, it takes, I think it's 6 or 7 verses until Yosef says, oh no, Dad, you've done it wrong. Why was he silent for a number of verses while Yaakov is already giving some of his blessings? Why didn't Yosef speak up right away? Is the question of the Kli Yakar. Why didn't he object immediately when the left hand was placed upon the head of the older? The left, again, I'm embarrassed to say this, the left hand, the inferior hand, was placed on the head of the superior / older son. Did he think that maybe the left is superior to the right? Oh, if only people could think that. We lefties would be so happy. But no. He's going to explain why there are occasions when we think of the left as superior. Why? Since the heart is on the left, and the heart is the source of intelligence, and the liver, the kaved, is on the right side and is the source of desires. This is fascinating because in the ancient world, they really did believe that the heart was the seat of intelligence. It was only much later, around the time of the Kliyakar, but he went back for the thinking like the ancients, that we started talking about, matters of the heart are emotional. It's just interesting that he's going back to the ancient thinking, which was that the heart is the seat of is the seat of intelligence. This is before we realized that the brain is where all thoughts come from, and that was the ancient world didn't know that. But the Kliyakar is talking about how the ancients talked about it. One more point. Not that I know very much about anatomy, but a number of doctors have told me over time that the heart is not on the left side. The heart is in the middle. If you look at a chart or pictures of the inside of a human body, the heart is mamish right in the middle. So how come we have this custom of thinking that the heart is on the left side? I mean, we in America, at least, you put your hand on your heart, for the Pledge of Allegiance or for the singing of the national anthem, because the side of the heart that does most of the pumping, you feel the bump of the heart on the left side. The heart itself is in the middle, but you feel the beating of the heart mostly on the left side in normal anatomy. Okay, that's all I know about anatomy. Okay. Since the heart is on the left and is the source of intelligence, the liver, the kaved, is on the right and is the source of desires. He thought, by the way, why did they think that the liver was the source of desires? Because when they cut open bodies, the liver was filled with blood. And that's true. That the liver is where blood gets cleaned and gets filtered in the body system, and the bad things are taken out in the liver. And so they saw, since the liver was so filled with blood, they thought, oh, we know that when someone feels emotional, they feel blood rushing to their head, they get embarrassed, and their face turns red because the blood is coming out. So they felt that the bloody nature of the liver was where desires and emotions were. Okay. So he thought, when Yaakov put his left hand on the head of Menashe, he thought that he was giving the older son a blessing of understanding, intelligence, knowledge. And he said, oh, that's not so bad. Only when the blessings start coming out and Yaakov says that Ephraim will be stronger than Menashe, did he understand that Yaakov was advancing the younger one. And this was Ra, evil, bad in his eyes. Why? Why did that bother Yosef? And I'm going to leave that question. Everybody knows the answer, because Yosef knew that, whenever you make the younger one rule over the older one, it's going to cause trouble. He knows all the troubles he had when he pushed himself in front of his older brothers. It only caused jealousy, animosity, trouble. We're going to return to that topic in about 5 or 6 minutes. But before we do that, we're going to take a look at Rav Hirsch. The next question, or the continuation question that I really want to discuss with you, is, when all is said and done, in 8 verses, Yaakov looks at these 2 boys and he says, whenever a Jewish parent wants to bless his children, he's going to say, you should be like Ephraim and Menashe. And to this day, that's the way Jewish sons are blessed on Friday night. So the question that we're going to be asking over the next few minutes, we're going to give 2 answers. First Hirsch, and then the answer that I really like. But Rabbi Hirsch's answer is very famous, so we'll deal with that first. And so this custom of Friday night was, may you be like Ephraim and Menashe. Um, and that was the only blessing we had for children. Now, it just so happens I know some people that continue to bless all of their children to be like Efraim and Menashe, even though sometime in um, in the early modern period, probably sometime in the 1600s, did the custom begin. When you look in the Shulchan Aruch, there's no blessing for daughters. If you look in ancient Sidurim from before the 1600s, there is no blessing for daughters. There's just a blessing for either sons or children, depending on how you want to translate the word banim. And there were people that blessed their daughters that they should be like Ephraim and Menashe. And there's still some people today that bless all of their children because the verse says, you bless your children, that may God make you like Efraim and Menashe. And children is boys and girls. I mean, the word banim can mean sons or it can be both. But at some point, it became the custom, like I said, in the 1600s, to make up the new blessing that, that the daughter should be like Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah. And nothing wrong with either blessing. I'm impressed when I see parents that say that their daughters should be like Efraim and Menashe because they were wonderful children, and we're going to see what made them so wonderful over the next few minutes. But today, like I said, if most modern Sidurim benchers have it that there's a blessing for the boys and a blessing for the girls, and they're separate. But that's a relatively modern development. There are some people that believe that, generally speaking, brachot only went to the boys because they were the ones that were earning the living for the family, and then for their wives and children in the future. So they were the ones that need the blessing. And there are other people that were of the opinion that this bracha to be like Efraim and Menashe was given to both young men and to young women, until we get till about 500 years ago, when, or 450 years ago, when we started to have a separate blessing for young women. Okay, so we're saying that our children should be like Efraim and Menashe, and why? So the famous answer from Rav Hirsch we'll do first, but I like the second answer better, even though there's a beautiful answer, but the other one I think is more powerful. Why do we bless our children to be like Efraim and Menashe? Jewish parents have prayed that their children withstand the temptations of exile and keep a strong Jewish identity. Hirsch is writing this in the 1860s in Germany. And he says, I want my children to be like Efraim and Menashe, who were able to stay Jewish in the diaspora, in the exile, in Egypt. And I want that to be true of our children here in Frankfurt am Main. Despite great odds, they grew up in Egypt and maintained adherence to Torah ideals and practice, which is why we bless our sons, I would say children, to be like them, expressing our hope for proud Jewish children and grandchildren. So he wrote this when he already had grandchildren. That otherwise he wouldn't have said that. Ephraim will become the armor of Yisrael against the rest of the world. Perhaps this refers to Yoshua, who could be called our armor against the world. Characteristically, we see the firstborn placed behind the younger. Characteristically, that was almost a norm. It was a norm for the book of Breshit. Right down from Cain and Hevel. Remember, Cain's the older, but it's Hevel's sacrifice that God accepted, and then Cain kills him. We find disregard for Bechorim. Yishmael gives place to Yitzchak, Esav to Yaakov, Reuven to Yosef, and now Menashe to Ephraim. And eventually rule of the Jewish nation will go to Yehuda. The goal in the book of Breshit, it's the goal, it's the purpose, it's the idea that was accepted, is Rav Ya'avod Tzair. This was the dream that was interpreted for Rivka. Rivka goes to some chacham, to some scholar, to get her situation explained. And part of the blessing is, and it gets eventually into the blessing from Yitzchak, that the greater will serve the younger. And that is either the blessing or the curse of the book of Breshit. Almost every story is a story of how a younger son gets control of the family rather than the Bechor, rather than the oldest son. But we often see spiritual power separated from national might. This was the idea that Netziv was talking about. Sometimes there are spiritual powers and sometimes there are physical powers, and they're not always the same. And Rav Hirsch, of course, is very cognizant of that. And that's when we have this famous quote from Yitzchak to Yaakov when he's tricking him about being Esav. Hakol kol Yaakov, the voice is the voice of Yaakov, talking Torah and sweetly. But the hands, the power, the strong, hairy hands, because he was wearing, the wool over his arms. Those are the powerful sinews of Esav. These are the two crowns which will ultimately be united in the Mashiach. So in other words, Rav Hirsch is saying throughout Jewish history, it's going to often be that the spiritual leader and the physical leader are going to be two separate individuals. And that's the way it's going to be until we get to Yemot Mashiach, until we get to the time of Mashiach b'meher v'yameinu. Okay, very beautiful answer to all of the questions about why we bless our children to be like them. Very nice, but not the most famous answer. And here, I don't know who the rabbi was that wrote this. I just grabbed this from the aish.com website, but it was not signed, the article. And in the article, it says, one of our most beautiful customs is for parents to bless their children at the start of the Shabbat. Boys are blessed not to be like the patriarchs, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, but rather to be like Ephraim and Menashe. Why? Why don't we say, like we say for the girls? Sarah, Rivka, Rechav, Leah. Why don't we say Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? One explanation, as opposed to Rav Hirsch's, new explanation, and this is the much more famous of the two. Abraham's, one explanation is that Efraim and Menashe were the first set of Jewish brothers who did not fight. They're the first brothers in the history of the world that we can see who got along. They loved each other. They supported each other. They were there for each other throughout their lives. That's why we bless them. Avram's two sons, Yitzchak and Yishmael, could not get along, and their disagreements form the basis of the Arab-Israeli conflict still today. Of course, we believe that the Arabs are the descendants of Yishmael. Yitzchak's two sons, Jacob and Esav, were so contentious that Esav repeatedly sought to kill Jacob until there was a reconciliation later in life. Even Jacob's sons sold Joseph and were ready to kill him. This explains why, when Yaakov blessed the Efraim and Menashe set of brothers, he purposely switched his hands, blessing the younger Ephraim before the older Menashe. Jacob wished to emphasize that there was no rivalry between these two brothers. It is with this thought that parents bless their children today, for there is no greater blessing than the peace amongst siblings. There's a very famous pasuk from Psalm 133 that says, Matov u'mana'im, how good and how pleasant Shevet achim gam yachad, when brothers, families dwell together. And Steinsaltz says on that pasuk, how good it is when all of the people of Israel and the people of Jerusalem, because that parak talks about the city of Yerushalayim, in particular, are in a place where they belong, enjoying one another's company. And the Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, adds on that pasuk in Tehillim, how good and pleasant it is for brothers to sit together when there is no jealousy between them. The greatest possible compliment that we can give Ephraim, that we can give Menashe. Ephraim was the powerful brother. He got the stronger blessing. But the greatest possible kudos should be given not to Ephraim, but to Menashe. Menashe is the one that breaks the mold. Menashe is the one who says, I'm not going to be jealous of my brother. When my brother goes up there to get his award, I'm not going to feel jealousy. I'm going to feel pride. I'm going to be so proud of my brother. I love it. That's what it's supposed to be. That's the way we're supposed to live. The v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, that you should love your fellow like yourself, means when they get something good, we're not supposed to say, why wasn't that me? Oh, I wish I got that. No, we're supposed to say, oh, wow, I'm so happy for you. And the first person who could do that is Menashe. So that's why I wrote at the top of the page, it's the left-handed compliment. By his being perfectly happy and satisfied with his bracha, which was not as good as his brother's, he is the one that shows I don't have to have kina. I can live without jealousy of my brother. I am happy for my brother. And it's Menashe that really ends the book of Breshit. Breshit is the book of sibling rivalry. I know that Freud said that the big problems in life come from intergenerational. Whether we're talking about Oedipus complex or Electra complex, whatever sexual innuendos that might have, which I don't want to deal with, but it has to do with parents and children. No, according to Sefer Bereshis, it's all about sibling rivalry. And the first person who breaks the mold of jealousy within the family setting is Menashe. And that's the left-handed compliment that he said, I'm happy for my brother. I have no jealousy. And that's why the book of Bereshit can end, because we finally came full circle. We broke the mold that started with Cain and Hevel of brothers hating each other. And we end with brothers, Shevet Achim Gam Yachad, who love each other and can dwell together. And it's fascinating. Throughout Jewish history, for the entire history of the Northern Kingdom, which basically lasts from about 950 BCE till about 720 BCE, when it was destroyed by the Assyrians. During that entire period, the tribe that most supported the kings from the tribe of Ephraim was his brother tribe of Menashe. Menashe was the most loyal of all the northern tribes for the kings of Ephraim, because they took on their Altazades, their great-grandfather's character trait of being happy for their brother. And that's just beautiful. This idea was used last year. It was actually Parshas Vayechi a year ago, day 67 of the war in Gaza, and Rachel Goldberg Poland, who was the mother, of course, of Hirsch, Alav Shalom, Hashem Yikom Damo. He was still alive at the time that she said this at this UN conference that was held in Geneva. But this was her message to the people 1 year ago, when this seemingly endless war was still relatively young. And she asked the question, why? Why Ephraim and Menashe? Why does the Torah say, bless your children to be like Efraim and Menashe? Because they are the first brothers since the creation of the world who love each other. Unlike Cain and Abel, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, and Joseph and his brothers, who are all filled with hate, violence, and jealousy, Ephraim and Menashe choose a different path. Even as we read in this week's Parsha, Vayechi, a year ago, when Yaakov places his right hand, the birthright blessing, on Ephraim, the younger of the two, and his left hand, the inferior blessing, on Menashe, the older brother, they choose not to give in to the intergenerational hatred around blessings and birthrights that had destroyed their family for generations. They break the cycle of hate. And all I can add to the words of Mrs. Goldberg Poland is let's pray that the cycle of hate is broken within the Jewish world, number one. But I just hope that we can break the cycle of hate that just is tearing apart our entire country and our globe. The last couple of years have just been filled with warfare all over the place. Here in Europe, a lot is going on in Africa as well, and we just have to hope and pray that we can find in our hearts to be like Menashe and not be jealous of what somebody else has, and be happy for them, and learn to be happy with what we have, and not necessarily to want somebody else's country and somebody else's home and somebody else's natural resources. If we can just learn to do that, then we really will have Shevet Achim Gam Yachad, then we really will have peace in the world, when all of humanity, we're all brothers, ultimately, when all brethren can learn to live in peace. And we all have to be like Menashe to be able to somehow achieve that. Probably won't be achievable till Mashiach comes. Until then, we have to win some more wars. But we have to pray for Shevet Achim Gam Yachad. Okay, thank you all very much for joining this evening. And like I said, we have goals for to get to peace in our own times. Good night, everyone.